I'm Ted Marchesi. The topic is assessment. I'm your host for the next 2 hours as we probe one of the hottest developments in American higher education, the assessment of student learning and college outcomes. It's a topic I have questions about, you have questions about. We have 2 hours together to get some of them answered. Let me welcome you on behalf of our three sponsoring organizations, the American Association for Higher Education, AAHE, the American College Personnel Association, ACPA, and NASPA, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. Our plan for the program is this. I'll kick things off with a briefing on the topic as an anchor for our discussion. Right after that, I'll introduce our panel, and off we'll go through 5 program sections of about 20 minutes each. First, we'll look more closely at assessment as an issue and at what's at stake in its development. Second, this movement is already 3 to 4 years old. What have we learned? Third, we'll ask the how question about methods and approaches to the doing of assessment. Fourth, we'll look harder at the potential connection between assessment and improvement. Fifth and finally, we'll talk about getting started and about getting help. Within each of these sections, I'll get the panel going with some first-level questions, then invite questions from our studio audience and your questions by phone. Our phone number, you might write it down now, though I'll repeat it later, is area code 816-576-7141. And that is the correct number. It is different in the program guide that you received. It's 576-7141. Our formal program runs 2 hours, with your calls taken and responded to along the way, after which we'll stay on the air for an additional half hour devoted entirely to your call-in questions. We have 3 phone lines coming in. Your calls will be answered by faculty members from Park College, the team led by Dr. Harry Blanton. When you call, state your name, where you're calling from, and your question in brief form. We'll get that written down quickly on a card so you can get back to the program. And from the cards, I'll put as many of your questions as I can to the panel. To set the immediate stage, we're on the air live from Kansas City with an audience of some 30 faculty and administrators from member colleges of the Kansas City Regional Council for Higher Education, KRCHE as it is called, people who've just concluded a 2-day conference on outcomes assessment. Our NUTN signal is traveling via Westar 4 to 252 campus downlink sites in the United States and Canada, all 50 states and 6 sites in Canada, making this perhaps the largest teleconference in the history of North American higher education. Many sites have 50, 100 or more participating academic and student affairs faculty on hand. Excuse me, often from several colleges in the area, meaning that 10 to 15,000 colleagues from hundreds of institutions are sharing this experience with you, and I'm sure have your concerns about this topic. So let's get going. What is this thing called an assessment movement? It's a set of developments, both political and educational. As a political phenomenon, this is a movement that got underway about 1985, pushed by activist governors and education-minded legislators who thought they saw in assessment a policy device to improve student and institutional performance. Today, 10 to 15 states, depending on how you count, have in place a legislative mandate or other formal program that requires colleges to do outcomes assessment now or in the immediate future. In 25 to 30 other states, things are at the stage of task forces, legislative hearings, or formal exhortation. There are 4 statewide meetings on this topic this month alone that I know of. Meanwhile, 3 Fridays ago, on September the 16th, formal regulations took effect at the federal level that require all accrediting agencies, regional and programmatic, as a condition for federal recognition to require of the institutions and programs they accredit formal evidence about student learning outcomes. What we see then as a result of these governmental initiatives is a new requirement applicable to private as well as public institutions to do assessment as a continuing condition for funding and approval. The full effects of these changes won't be felt in many institutions for a while yet, but over the years, the provision of public evidence about student learning will become a part of the way all of us conduct our business. Not just politicians, though, have seen promise in assessment. Educators increasingly have turned to it as a powerful tool for the reform of undergraduate education. Reforms that would make the undergraduate experience more purposeful, coherent, involving, and effective. You may recall that 4 falls ago, 2 very influential reports came out. The first, from the National Institute of Education, called Involvement in Learning, reviewed decades of research on college-level learning and came out with 27 recommendations under 3 headings: set high expectations for students, involve them with their learning, assess and provide feedback. A month later, the AAC report, Integrity in the College Curriculum, also made this learning assessment linkage, saying it was a scandal that we didn't assess the impacts of our teaching. Since that time, vigorous attempts to link assessment with efforts to revitalize general education, to improve teaching, to use technology, teach critical thinking, enhance basic skills, and so on have gone forward on many campuses, private and public. In short, the impulse to assess has come only in part from government. The idea of assessment, the methods of assessment, the impulse to use assessment for improvement, all come from within the academy. As you can see, the word assessment covers a lot of ground. I resist, myself, any single narrow definition of the term. Generally, though, assessment refers to methods for understanding better the phenomena and outcomes of student learning. Information derived from assessment can be used for several purposes, to help make judgments about individual students, for example, to advise or place or certify them, or to make judgments about the effectiveness of a sequence of courses, like in writing, general education, or a chemistry major, or about an entire 2- or 4-year college experience. Assessment done well and over time is intended to produce feedback, useful to improvement. And it is improvement, not data collection. Improvement of curricula and teaching, of student effort and learning, that's the real goal of this process. I said assessment refers to a set of methods for learning about student learning. The methodologies of assessment are numerous and growing, which is as it should be because college-level learning entails subtle, complex phenomena. Methods in use today include student interviews, both individual and group, questionnaires and surveys, statistical indicators such as of dropout, graduation, and graduate acceptance rates, the reading by departmental faculty of student transcripts and exams, a use of external examiners visiting faculty or practitioners to jury student work. From the corporate world, we have the assessment center method. Results from standardized tests can be used, either homegrown or commercially available. There's portfolio analysis, follow-up reports from employers, and so on and on. Because learning outcomes are subtle and complex, as I've said, the gospel of the assessor is that multiple methods used over time offer the proper basis for judgment. Assessment at the college level implies methodological variety. I've just named a baker's dozen methods of assessment. If you looked across them and asked, what are the assumptions? What's the mindset of the assessor? At least 5 things stand out. First, assessment starts with clarity about intended outcomes. You can't make a judgment about a program, much less about how to assess it, unless you're clear about what that program is supposed to accomplish. A good thing about assessment, then, is that it forces you to think much harder and concretely about curricular purposes and about teaching goals. But unless you've got clarity about outcomes, what specifically do we expect our engineering graduates of assessment can? Assessors' focus is on performance, on what students know and can do with their knowledge, and standards of performance become a goal. So with student writing, for example, the assessor would reject passing along or graduating students who did no more than pass English 101, 102 with a C. Instead, the assessor would say to students, you must show us you can write at this defined high level of ability. 1 course, no courses, 6 courses, however. To earn a degree, we expect you to meet this faculty set performance standard. Third, most of these methods involve some aspect of externality, the common sense idea that someone besides the cook should taste the pudding. In education, that someone beyond the individual professor should judge student performance. In the United States, unlike in Europe, we combine instruction and the evaluation of learning in single courses, both functions done by the same instructor. Add up the credit hours and a degree is awarded. What assessment asks for is some mechanism of quality control that looks at student learning cumulatively across courses, that asks, what does all this course taking add up to? This implies judgments by faculty, collectively, asking on the basis of our graduates' performance, does our departmental major in accounting or French or microbiology achieve its intended learning outcomes? A fourth bias of the assessor is for methods of learning about learning that are richest in feedback and that have, therefore, the greatest potential to improve learning. A simple statistic like a dropout rate or many standardized tests produce very little usable feedback. Their data are hard to connect with specific fixable features of curriculum or teaching, which is why these approaches have tended to lose ground in the past year or two in favor of richer, more qualitative approaches. Fifth, underlying all these approaches is the factor of expert human judgment. I mention this because newcomers to the topic often think assessment means testing and data and numbers and quantification. Please be reminded tests are a small part of the universe of assessment methods. Tests, for that matter, are scored by computers, but humans make them up. What we see across all methods, external examiners, interview data, questionnaire construction, portfolio review, is the application of human judgment, expert and trained, we hope, applied to the complex phenomena of college-level learning. Assessment is not about bean counting. It calls for good people to get their minds around tough questions. Let me conclude these introductory remarks with two broader observations. First, we're 3 to 4 years into this thing called assessment, but already a distortion of sorts is apparent. That is, too much of the early focus has been on outcomes, narrowly defined, cognitive outcomes such as writing skills or knowledge from a major. The problems with that narrowness are several. For one, it slights other important goals of a college, like the development of values or interpersonal abilities or multicultural awareness. Further, what happens in a classroom doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's very much affected by student out-of-class experiences, so it is the total college experience we want to keep in view when we investigate college outcomes. Further still, learning outcomes are a function of more than the college's programs, in class or out. They are a function of student preparation and effort and time on task. So we want to know about that side of the equation too. This view of the topic, the union of cognitive with affective, of in class with out of class, of college effort with student effort, stands behind the joint sponsorship of this teleconference and the deliberate mix of academic and student affairs faculty on our panel. Finally, lots of the discussion you hear about assessment is full of scare. Act now or the governor will mandate something stupid, and so on. But in fact, we're several years into this, and not many stupid things have happened. Far more good and creative things have. And so I have no hesitancy in calling to the banners of assessment our best minds and most caring people. A lot is at stake here. Done wrong, this thing can be dangerous. But done right, it can be a powerful agent for better education. On the positive side, here is an issue that is intellectually interesting, that takes us back to first questions, that puts the focus on students, that defines quality, not in terms of endowments or library books or SAT scores, but in terms of contribution to learning. More than a mandate or set of techniques, assessment helps us rethink the ways we work on behalf of students. It's time now to go to our panel. Let me introduce them. What we're going to do in this first program segment, which is called The Issue, the Stakes, is go around and meet our panelists. And we're going to do so by welcoming each of them with a question. And so let me turn to my colleague, Pat Hutchings. Pat, you're an English professor, a department chair. You've been at the central organization in the assessment movement for the past 2 years now, the AHE Assessment Forum. And I mentioned these state mandates. And you've traveled around to confer with people in probably 20 states now. What are the states after? What do the governors want?
Well, an answer I know you've heard as many times as I have, Ted, is that the states are looking for accountability, for reporting. That's to be said with a sneer, of course.
Yes.
And the institutions, on the other hand, are looking for improvement. The fact of the matter is, accountability seen from another angle looks suspiciously like improvement, and vice versa. So that formulation is, it seems to me, neither very helpful nor very accurate. And in some ways, in fact, it seems to me the governors have been very direct about what they want. The title of the National Governors Association report was A Time for Results, and what the governors want are results. They want more and better performance from institutions and from students, it seems to me. They look around, they see the same range of declines in this and declines in that that suggest that we simply need to do better.
Pat, there's a lot of ways that a state might try to get institutions and students to do better. Why is the updraft on assessment right now? Why all this focus on assessment?
Well, one reason is certainly the K through 12 experience. Johnny couldn't read. What did the states do? They put in place an assessment program, which means, at that level, statewide testing. It does not, as you've pointed out, mean that here. And in some people's mind, that seems to have helped. A happier reason, it seems to me, is that assessment, as you've just described it, has a kind of natural and inevitable appeal, not only to professional educators, but to lay people who care about education. It looks at learning in terms of longer, larger, real-life knowledge and abilities, and it's no surprise that appeals to governors.
Yes. Thanks, Pat. Charles Schroeder, you're an experienced administrator in both public and private institutions. You're the past president of ACPA. You're now the vice president of a urban private institution. You're also a resident of the state of Missouri, where Governor Ashcroft has all but ordered the public institutions to do something in the name of assessment. But of course that order doesn't apply to private colleges. What's in this issue for a private university?
Well, what's in it are some of the same things that Pat mentioned earlier, certainly accountability, but in our case not to the taxpayers, but to ourselves and to our students. We have certain objectives. We have to be able to demonstrate in accord with those objectives. I think another issue for us is generating timely information on our students, on the nature of their experience, so that we can connect the input, the students, with the process, what happens with the intended outcomes. I think another thing that private institutions are becoming increasingly aware of is the need for strong enrollment management initiatives.
Involved and to take a leadership role in this issue of assessment. What's in this issue for community colleges? Why is the Futures Commission leaning on the two-year colleges to get involved?
Well, Ted, I think the current educational reform movement has occurred just as many community colleges were redefining their missions, were competing more heavily than ever before with four-year colleges and universities for students and program resources. We're trying to meet the educational demands of business and labor, and also trying to provide access and continue to provide access to students who may not have any opportunity to participate in higher education at all. So the assessment movement is very important to community colleges in wanting to reassure themselves and society that they do provide quality programs and services, and to also that the assessment has a positive outcome for both the programs and services and the students, and can combat some of the negative images of both the community college's intent and effectiveness and the negative images that it can put on the students that it serves.
Yeah, a lot of community colleges have been getting beat over the head lately because of published reports of low, for example, student graduation rates out of the transfer curricula. If we have richer, deeper, more information about that, don't those institutions become even more vulnerable to criticism?
I don't think so, Ted, because I think that richer, deeper assessment can show that they have provided student success, that they have both programmatic and student success. And I think that the community colleges are a good place to show that this success can occur at many different levels, that you have base levels and that you have sub-levels of success. And I think that's a real important thing for community colleges to prove to our society.
Yes,
and a place
I agree.
that they have to share.
I agree. Pat Cross, I think a lot of people know that you just moved from Harvard to Berkeley. I'll bet you many people who are watching don't know that you began your professional career in student affairs at Cornell in Illinois. I think many viewers have known you for the last 20 years as one of the premier research analysts in American higher education, and you've written extensively about community colleges, teaching and learning, curriculum, non-traditional education, adult learners. Now you're very interested in assessment. What brings your mind and work to this topic?
Well, I suppose in part we can say it's a product of our times. Practically everyone in society as well as in education is interested in improving performance. We hear it in the manufacture of automobiles or in banks or whatever. People are interested in doing a better job. Particularly important, I think, in education right now, because we've spent almost the last 2 decades primarily concerned with more quantitative aspects of higher education. At first, we were building, we were recruiting for the baby boom generation, and our big worry was how to accommodate all of the people who needed to be accommodated. Then we came into the 1970s, and we were concerned with the opposite numbers, the negative numbers, the retrenchment, or the threatened retrenchment of higher education. Now I think we are really concerned with, while we haven't solved the access problem, it has changed direction. We want to know whether we're giving all of those new people who've gained access through this building a good education. That's ultimately what access is about. So since I've spent most of my career worrying about questions of access, I'm now quite interested in whether we're doing the best job possible after spending a couple decades working on access.
So that to use an old figure of speech, the open door is not a revolving door. So you relate this to improving the effectiveness
That's right.
which we can serve new learners. Yes, yes. Gary Hansen, you have a relatively unique professional position. I think you're namely, you're a full-time researcher within a student affairs unit. You are a regular and valued contributor to the research literature on student learning and growth, but you're also an active person within an active student affairs office. You also have a very critical role that you play within the Texas Academic Skills Council, I know, which is trying to put together a statewide program under the gun of a mandate in that state. But my question is this. We already know a lot about students. And we've got lots of all kinds of research studies. We have course grades and other indicators of student achievement. Do we really need more of this? What does assessment add to the picture?
Ted, I think it's very true that the students have been studied, and some students on our campus may claim that they've been studied to death. But I think you will find in every college and university across the country bookshelves full of studies that have been bound and are collecting large amounts of dust. And I think what the assessment mandate that we're currently caught up in now brings to us is the mandate to get that information into the hands of faculty, into administrators, and use it, and to develop new instruments, to develop new procedures, to look at students differently. I think in the past our rationale, our motive for studying students was one of intellectual curiosity. Now, with the external issue of accountability and the emphasis on improving what we do, there's a very different motivation for getting out there and getting involved in doing assessment.
You almost have to use the information that you're going to generate, because what folks in Austin are interested in is not the reports and the accountability. They're interested in things improving, and they're going to have documentation on whether that in fact is occurring.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think one of the implications of that is that we have to start looking at some new strategies and new techniques for the kinds of assessment that we do.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that's happened from the assessment movement is a greater appreciation, I think, for multiple modes of inquiry. I think historically we've tended to operate out of the old scientific, objective, reductionistic mode, standardized testing, let's get this down to a number, and that has now broadened. And I look at contributions by Goob and Lincoln, for example, that promote the naturalistic evaluation, where we look at that mode of inquiry in terms of the rationale as exploration, finding out why. And I think that's a big distinction, and the difference that we have today is that we not only want to know the what about student learning,
Right.
we want to know the why.
So that
and
we can fix
the
it or make it better.
And that's right.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary.
I think one of the other things
Right.
that is happening in the assessment movement is a move towards a greater level of detail, particularly in diagnostic information, trying to get that information early on so we can do something.
Yeah.
And there's a real movement. The outcome movement, I think, is traditionally thought of as an endpoint, that we're going to do something at the end. But what I see happening around the country is the baseline information, the information as students come in, has to be different,
Just as
and we're
important.
having to pick up some
Right.
new kinds
Okay.
of things.
Everybody is now introduced. You're a wonderful panel. I want you to behave like a panel now and take a shot at a different and larger question, and that is, we're 3 or 4 years into a movement nationally that probably is going to take 10 years to fully work itself out. Where are we now? What is at stake? What concerns you about where we are right now? What's at stake? Who wants to take a shot at that?
Well, I'll jump in. It seems to me that one of the things that's at stake is an opportunity for faculty, or maybe the better word is educators, across the campus, across the entire institution, to engage each other in educational discussions. That sounds like an obvious and good thing to happen, and yet I think most of us know that it doesn't happen very often. Assessment pushes people to ask together, what is it we want our students to know and to be able to do, and how will we help them do that better than they're doing it now? And even setting aside all the data and information gathering dimensions of assessment, which obviously are important too, those conversations in and of themselves seem to me to be an awfully important opportunity.
What else is at stake, Jackie?
I think another thing that's at stake is institutional autonomy. I think it's very important that institutions realize that if they don't get into and get involved at all levels of the institution in putting together assessment instruments and working with their students, that it's going to come from on high. It's going to be state mandated, mandated by legislators who may not understand all of the ins and outs of the educational programs and services that we're trying to provide. So I think
That's
institutional
for sure.
autonomy is very important
That's
for us to think about and remember.
Yes. Pat Cross?
Well, I guess when you said, where are we, I thought of, well, really, where are we in terms of the timeline? And my answer would be about halfway. But about halfway because much of the first concern started, I think, away from the institutions. That is, it started in legislatures and it started in states. Then it began to move on campus, I would say, to where campuses really became interested in it. Now I see it, from my perspective and my interest, moving into the classroom or into various student government groups. And I think it still has another notch to go in moving into student awareness. The students, we think of governors already as involved in assessment. We don't very often think of students involved in assessment. So it seems to me we really do have a very honest trickle-down here, and that we are now working on what seems to me the really critical end of that, and that's where learning really takes place, in the classroom, the corridors, the dormitories, and so forth.
Doesn't that trickle up?
Well, it has started to trickle down. Maybe it's now trickling up.
Okay. Gary?
I think another internal implication of what's at stake is that the assessment is really a double-edged sword in many respects, because assessment broadens the decision-making base about students and what we do for students. And information is influence. And the capacity to use information to change things is very, very powerful. What happens, the other side of that, is the fact that that's going to dislodge some of the current mode of operation, the current decision-making. It's going to change the power structure. And people need to be aware that that's coming down the road.
I want our viewing audience to know that we have a live audience here in Kansas City, and we're going to be taking questions from the live audience. And I see standing at the microphone actually the president of the Kansas City Regional Council for Higher Education, Kirche, Larry Rose. Larry, welcome.
Nice to be with you here.
Please ask a question if you want.
I want, first of all, to say that we all are in the debt of AAHE, you, Pat Hutchings, Russ Edgerton, for the work that you've been doing to keep this issue alive and to move it along nationally. We've just completed a nearly brilliant two-day conference here in Kansas City under the auspices of my organization and Central Missouri State University, the Metropolitan Community Colleges of Kansas City, Missouri, and the University of Missouri, Kansas City. We did, by the way, arrive at all the answers to these questions. Unfortunately, we weren't able to package them in time for this teleconference. But what was slightly troubling about that was just a touch of humor, Ted. What was slightly troubling about that conference, and I want to pick up on something Pat Cross just said, was that there was hardly a mention of the direct role of students in pursuing, especially these general education outcomes. One of the ideas I'd like to insert in this discussion at this early stage, especially since we have student affairs and academic affairs people combined here unusually, is this: if you want me to accomplish what you have in mind as goals for me, then you will do better if I know what those goals are. And I think we could do a heck of a lot more than we're currently doing as this assessment discussion proceeds on the academic side of the house, roughly, by way of strengthening orientation and advising programs and of better acquainting students with what it is we want them to achieve. It's called letting students in on the outcome secret.
Oh, Pat Cross.
Well, it seems to me that's a very crucial point, and it really fits in very well with some emerging research in cognitive psychology. That is, the more aware people are of themselves as learners, the better learners they become. So it's not only important that they kind of contribute to it, but it's important that they become self-aware and conscious of themselves as learning, developing people. So I think it has more reasons than just political reasons. It really has student development reasons behind it.
Thank you, Larry and Pat. We have our first call-in question. It's from Dr. John Pratt of Colorado State University. And Dr. Pratt asks, with regard to your third facet of assessment, the business about externality, what is your view of a university delegating, graduating, responsibility for graduation requirements, making judgments about a student's qualifications to graduate, to individual academic departments? Should a department assume responsibility, I presume the question means, for whether a student graduates? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Seems to me that a department has a responsibility, put the camera on, that a department has a responsibility for looking at the responsibility of its graduates in its particular area. So you would want a school or college of education to assume responsibility for the readiness to teach of the teacher preparation candidates that it is prepared. But there is also a university-wide faculty responsibility to see if the larger outcomes that are intended for the baccalaureate are met by the graduates who are awarded a university degree. It's not a departmental degree. Anyone else?
Well, I guess it seems not as unusual a question to me as it might, because I'm teaching all graduate students, and of course that's virtually solidly based in the department. But that's the kind of specialization that does not ordinarily, or we don't think of it ordinarily, as requiring the general education course. So while I wouldn't want to see the department solely responsible for undergraduate, I certainly think they should have strong influence.
I think the role of the faculty is crucial in generating those expectations and setting those standards of what is expected of our students at the time or by the time they graduate. and that's clearly a departmental level function of our faculty. I think that very few faculty would probably want to be involved in the actual certification and degree granting and taking the sole responsibility for the institution. I think it has to be shared, but at the initial dialogue level, certainly those expectations have to be agreed upon within the departmental level.
And communicated to students. Okay, I'm going to conclude now this first program section on the issue of states with a couple of brief remarks and say that from what I have heard, quite a few difficult topics attached to the assessment bandwagon. A lot is at stake. Whether we will be able to do this well over time, find ways genuinely to serve students better, that's the question. Let me go now to the second major section of our program, labeled Trends and Development. And I want to begin this segment by putting some questions to my colleague, Pat Hutchins, who's had as good a chance as anybody nationally to think about what's going on. Pat, we're not on the same page as we were 3 or 4 years ago on this issue. What has happened? What is different now from in these early classes?
Lots is different. Lots has happened. There's a lot more out there. Let me see if I can just list some of the things, and please refer back to your earlier comments, I think. First of all, there are more states involved. That means necessarily more campuses. On those campuses, I think we see more experience as opposed to just plans with a broader range of methods and approaches. We see more literature developing. Rosie Bass has come out with, I think, 4 or 5 books in the last year. We see more instrument development, both at the local level and for testing organizations. More resources and resource centers to turn to. A national conference on assessment. We're coming up on our 4th one. There were 1,000 people at the last one. And today is a good piece of evidence for the fact that this is definitely still moving.
You know, I can tell you haven't stopped me with professor and use characters, I'm sure there's more there. Probably the most important part of all that's happening in this issue with all the things you mentioned is the real growth in campus experience. That is what lends completeness and body to the literature of the campus. What is going on? What are people on campus most interested in under the heading of assessment?
Well, the thing I get asked about most often is the assessment of general education outcomes. And there are probably a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's a frequently mentioned piece in there. Let me see if I can just list some of the things, and please refer back to your earlier comments, I think. First of all, there are more states involved. That means necessarily more campuses. On those campuses, I think we see more experience as opposed to just plans with a broader range of methods and approaches. We see more literature developing. Rosie Bass has come out with, I think, 4 or 5 books in the last year. We see more instrument development, both at the local level and for testing organizations. More resources and resource centers to turn to. A national conference on assessment. We're coming up on our 4th one. There were 1,000 people at the last one. And today is a good piece of evidence for the fact that this is definitely still moving.
You know, I can tell you haven't stopped me with professor and use characters, I'm sure there's more there. Probably the most important part of all that's happening in this issue with all the things you mentioned is the real growth in campus experience. That is what lends completeness and body to the literature of the campus. What is going on? What are people on campus most interested in under the heading of assessment?
Well, the thing I get asked about most often is the assessment of general education outcomes. And there are probably a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's a frequently mentioned piece in state mandate language, maybe most frequently. Maybe a more fundamental reason, a better reason to go at it, I think, is that, as Ernie Boyer said a few years ago, general education is a disaster area, and it's an area many campuses have been in the midst of cleanup. mode for a number of years now. In that context of curricular reform, assessment falls neatly, and I think rightly, best possible place, as a vehicle for finding out whether changes are actually improvements. And even if on campuses where those curricular reform conversations aren't already taking place, assessment may be the prompt for conversations about general education. So it's a good match.
Right. General education. What else?
I guess one of the other more promising dimensions of this is the assessment of basic skills, usually at entry and for purposes of placement and remediation. That is a good place to begin, I think most campuses are finding. It's a place you can later build on for looking at outcomes. It provides real answers to real questions about real students, and faculty tend to care about that information. So it's a good way to get off on the right foot.
What about assessment in the major?
That's an odd one, and one that's gotten lots and lots of attention in the last year, of standing room only crowds at conferences and so forth. That has not been the bone of public external contention. The argument is not that people don't know chemistry or sociology, but they can't think critically or whatever.
Teacher education will be the exception.
There are some exceptions, that's true. Internally, however, within the institution, I think you could argue that assessment of the major is one of the most productive routes to take. There's greater consensus within departments about hopes for student achievement, appropriate outcomes, probably a better chance of attaching assessment information to fixable pieces of teaching and curriculum. That's always a problem. And there's a ready client for all that information. So assessment in the major is good news.
Anything else? What's different now from 3 or 4 years ago? Any other member of the panel want to come in on this?
Well, it seems to me there's much heavier involvement from people on the campus. I mean, you go onto a campus and a lot of people are fairly articulate about assessment. There are still a whole group of people that unfortunately think of it largely in terms of tests. But I think both the variety of people involved and the variety of measures involved is the thing I notice so much about it.
Picking up on that, the diversity of the students, even in the last 3 or 4 years, but particularly in the last 10 years, we have students with a wider range of ability, wider range of ethnicity. We have more women in colleges, more returning adult students, and all of those subgroups of students are coming in with different kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of characteristics, different levels of preparation. And that makes a more complex, more difficult role for assessment.
Yes, yes. Jackie and then Charles.
Ted, I also think that the sub-theme of this conference is something that many campuses, both 2 and 4 year, have recognized in the shared responsibility. Participation rates are definitely influenced by policy. And I think that trustees and administrators, faculty and students have all seen that they all have some responsibility, and that policy goals must reflect student needs if they're going to be successful.
Yes.
And that's something that's now occurring on our campuses. They're not asking what, they're asking why and what is my role and how do we work together. Collaboration is the challenge.
Charles?
Ted, I think another thing that's certainly become an issue of awareness for most campuses is the fact that learning and development don't simply occur in a vacuum, as we said before, that residence halls shape student behavior, organizations that students participate in, campus jobs, a variety of things. So I think we're trying to understand the interactions of students with different opportunities on campus, different support systems, trying to accommodate the diversity that Gary spoke of. And I think the sensitivity of that is playing itself out in new assessment methods that help us make sense of that.
Yeah. Thank you, Charles. I want to go back to our studio audience and introduce my friend Peter Ewell from the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems in Boulder. Peter got into this assessment issue actually go back in the early 1980s, and I would say that you have been on more campuses struggling with assessment than maybe any other person in the whole country. I also want to say that Peter and I were in China last August and attending a Sino-American conference on, you guessed it, assessment and evaluation. And some parts of the very conversation that is going on in the United States is going on in the People's Republic of China right now. Also, as we know, in the Soviet Union, in the common market countries, in Brazil, there are worldwide aspects to this movement, which is another topic. Peter, I want to ask you, though, what's different now from whenever you began getting interested in assessment?
I think, Ted, the biggest single trend reflects some of the panel's comments of just a couple of minutes ago, and I would summarize them under the theme of making assessment more naturalistic, making it fit the natural rhythms of the campus. And there are a couple of pieces to that I see time and time again. One is a methodological opportunity, which is taking advantage of what I like to call existing points of contact with students. We already have lots of places where we collect data or information from students in the classroom, through course evaluations, through periodically administered surveys, in the registration process, in orientation. And I see many more campuses saying instead of having this thing called assessment be a graft on a separate activity where lots of people sit in a room and take an examination, that they're taking advantage of those existing points of contact and making them more creative. Now that leads to the second theme, which is that the ultimate point of contact is, as Pat Cross says, the classroom. And I see an awful lot more assessment going on integrated into the classroom setting. One of the greatest manifestations of that is the reinvention across the country of the senior comprehensive examination that used to be a part of the curriculum
in the 19th century,
or even more recently than that.
Yeah.
And you see more and more of that kind of thing going on in the major. And some of the more creative attempts across the country to use portfolio analyses and secondary reading of existing course essays and final examinations by college-wide reading committees in order to get at some things like critical thinking, ability to formulate problems, and so on. And I think that's one of the most promising developments we see, because it's bringing the movement back to, I think, the roots of teaching and learning.
Peter, stay there.
All right.
We'll take a call-in question from George Grimes at Eastern Michigan University. I'll just put it right to you, and we'll have an audience-to-audience question. And the question is, do you think that the assessment of student learning genuinely offers an opportunity to improve the educational experience, or is it just another fad? Peter, is assessment a fad?
I don't think it's a fad. Now, there are many ways of defining a fad. If the question about a fad is it going to go away, I don't think it's going to go away. I think that some of the trends that have already been mentioned by the panel in terms of state mandates, these things being written into legislation, accountability devices already put into place, means that it's something that 5, 6, 7 years ago, years from now, we are not going to be able to ignore, and it will be out there. So I don't think it's going to go away. Now, the second part of the question, which was the first part of the question as it was in fact posed, is does it have genuine opportunities for improvement? And I think it does. And again, I'd like to echo what I think some of the panel members said. It's often in the posing of the questions that it has its biggest dividends. And that first point of contact, something you're going to get to later, the way in which a campus gets itself organized in posing that question, sets the whole tenor of that discussion.
Yes. Peter, thank you. We're going to come back to that. Does any panelist want to take a crack at whether this is a fad or not? This is a question that was frequently asked about 2 years ago before, as Peter said, things sort of started to get written into the law.
I tend to agree with Peter that I don't think this is a fad. I think what's happening is assessment is becoming a state of mind, an attitude that will be long-term, and it will not go away, and I think there are two reasons for that. One is that if we do assessment well, what people find is they do it more, and they get better at it, and so there's a self-renewing process that goes on. When you find something that works, you tend to continue it, and I think people are now discovering that assessment works. Plus, our external public, our legislative people, our governors, our employers, simply won't let it go away until they start seeing a major change, and that's not going to happen overnight. So it's going to be here a good long time.
Last word, Jackie?
Just wanted to say that if we look at our history books about how education was framed in the past and how it's going to be framed in the future, I think we're talking about quality of education, and assessment, the term as we use it, may change and evolve differently. But basically talking about quality education is something that we've always been interested and involved with, and so that's not going to go away.
The long-term demand is for quality improvement, for higher levels of performance out of schools and students, and whether it's assessment or whatever, that part of it is not going to go away. Let me bring another question from our viewers to the panel. Joan Wadlow, Provost of the University of Oklahoma, asks, how can we combine a senior learning experience designed to integrate all of the undergraduate education with assessment?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that that's exactly what you ought to be trying to do. And that, as Peter Ewell said, this ought not to be a sort of graft-on thing, something that happens on top of all of the learning stuff. Opportunities and activities and experiences for students that are educational in and of themselves should be seen as opportunities for generating information that we can then use to make judgments not only about those students but maybe about pieces of the program and so forth. So, I mean, we don't know what the senior experience she's talking about is, but it seems to me almost regardless.
Right.
That's a place for assessment to take place.
Some of the great capstone senior experiences are in the arts. And people ought to look to their arts departments in music, studio art, and so on to see good examples. There's also a whole chapter on this in Ernie Boyer's book, College. Okay, I want to end this section by suggesting that when we've looked at the trends in assessment, we see an issue that probably has a good long travel. It has a far horizon, but it's a horizon with more than a few clouds on it. Okay, we're now going to move to our third program section called Questions of Method. And I want to start out by asking the panel, many methods can be applied in the name of assessment. Some are surely more helpful than others. What are some of the more promising examples that you've seen from the field? And I think we were going to start with Gary on this.
Yes, I think, and I alluded to it when I first started talking, and the move in the direction of trying to build assessment instruments that get at diagnostic feedback information to let students know early on in the collegiate experience where they stand. And the movement to assessing basic skills is one that we in the state of Texas have been grappling with to try and come up with an instructional program, part of which includes an assessment of where students start when they enter the front door. And so all students attending a public institution in the state of Texas will be taking an assessment of basic skills. State legislature mandated that it would be a diagnostic instrument. And I think it's an interesting point that that was an external mandate, that it would be diagnostic in nature.
Yeah.
Principle there is that that's the kind of information that really helps students.
Okay. So, instruments that are more diagnostic. Pat Cross, what's your interesting method that you have seen?
Well, I think in many ways we talk about faculty involvement in assessment,
Right.
but I want to drive that even one point further to say I think faculty ought to be intellectually invested in assessment. That is, they ought to be not just serving on committees that would help construct assessment measures, but they ought to be asking their own questions that they would like to know about what students are learning in their classroom. And that's what I call intellectual investment. They ought to be curious about how students are learning, whether various of their methods are effective. So I've been talking about classroom research as being something that can be done, and I think it need not go into complicated sampling or statistical design. A lot of the methods where you can learn a lot about what students are learning are very simple, what I would call qualitative methods. A good discussion question, for instance, is a very good assessment technique. Because you are asking people to think critically while you're evaluating how critically they have thought in answering the question. So if people spent more time kind of designing the kind of questions that go right, and it has to do with the comments about naturalistic, it ought to flow right in so that you have a loop even in the classroom from what students are learning to how it's assessed to how you try to get them to think deeper and so forth.
Yes.
So I think it can be a very simple and it need not take a lot of fancy requirements.
Right. People should know that the National Center for Research on Post-Secondary Teaching and Learning, known by the mouthful Encryptal, has just published a handbook for use by classroom instructors on classroom assessment techniques. It's got 20 or 30 of them, and a lot of them are simple and easy to do, and I wish I had thought of them when I was teaching. Good. Let's go to Jackie Woods. What's your
I think many of the student service people in the audience will agree with me that building student profiles or self-reported data is a very, very important thing that we need to keep in mind for both student service persons to use and academicians to use as they're putting together their assessment profile of the students they deal with. And I think the important thing in using this technique in combination with the other information that you gather on students is the quality of the questions that you ask. I think a lot of the non-cognitive or affective information that we've asked of our students has been built around traditional age students and the traditional college age type of student. And we need to understand that many of our students in both our 2- and 4-year institutions now are what we call non-traditional students and bring different experiences and skills and achievements to that. And we should ask about those and build them into the assessment process.
Point, thanks. Pat.
Well, I'd like to put in a plug for the Assessment Center, which, though its name may not suggest it, is more a set of methods than it is a place. And it's a set of assessment methods that's found a particularly natural home with the professional areas, nursing, teacher education and certification, medicine. Yes, and it involves the simulation of some real-life task or problem or situation in which the assessees, students in this case, perform and are observed in that performance by trained expert assessor judges. I'd like to give just a brief example from my work at Alverno College, where a number of assessment center methods are used. This was one that involved, this is an important point, 200 students. It was a nearly day-long experience, and it took place at the end of a second semester during which all of those students would have had a similar, though not identical, cluster of courses. And the situation was this. Each student was asked to become, for that day, a member of an advisory council to a local library. And their task was to make decisions about the use of certain video materials for educational programming from that library. They had not only to choose them, but to frame how they would be used, what kinds of messages could be conveyed through them, and so forth. So in the course of the day, students were involved in group problem solving and decision making, individual writing and analysis tasks. They needed to have bring a sense of historical context to bear. They needed to deal with analysis of cultural values vis-a-vis their own. Lots of different kinds of ability and knowledge being called on, in short. And during all of this, at various points, they evaluated each other's performance, observed external observers came in and evaluated it. At the end of the day, they engaged in self-assessment. The good news about all of this, and it is obviously time and energy consuming, is that you get very integrated kinds of learning rather than discrete little bits and pieces that I don't think faculty care very much about. You get detailed diagnostic feedback, going back to a point we've heard before, and something that I feel very strongly about and that hasn't, maybe is the next step beyond teachers and classrooms, and that is a concern about the quality of the assessment experience for the student. The students learn something by doing this, and they leave that experience different from when they came in.
Thank you. Very valuable. Charles.
I guess I'd like to make a plug for institutional research, but not in the way we normally think about institutional research. A number of the panelists have mentioned about the diversity we find in terms of student characteristics today. We have on our campus a department similar to one that Gary created at the University of Texas at Austin. It's called Student Life Studies. And staff in Student Life Studies 4 or 5 years ago started a project called TRAILS, Tracking Retention and Academic Integration by Learning Styles. They essentially created a cumulative database. So for entering students, we use as a tool a Myers-Briggs type indicator, which we find useful in describing learning styles. But each semester into that database is entered the student's choice of major, school affiliation, the grade point average, and whether they remain in that particular school. So we can track their performance and relate their performance to certain variables that we find quite helpful to faculty. We share that information not in terms of institutional reports, but in terms of talking with faculty in the School of Nursing, the School of Allied Health, and even getting at times information on teaching styles and the relative fit between the two. So we found it as a very helpful way of identifying students at risk, students that need special kinds of intrusive support, and it has been able to give us some predictive ability in terms of retention and attrition patterns.
Yes, very, very good. What characterizes powerful assessment. You've named 5 different methods that are interesting, but what characterizes them? Gary?
To take a crack at that, I think, in my experience, one of the clear characteristics that differentiates a good assessment from one that is not very useful is it has to be simple.
Yeah.
And it has to provide feedback to the student. And I think we've all, in one way or another, commented on that the information has to be used, and you have to give feedback, and it has to be used. And those are two, you know, that I find real helpful.
Yeah.
Pat mentioned too. She said it has to be an important question to the person who can act upon it.
Yeah.
So if you get trivial questions that are questions that can be measured, but you don't really want to know the answer, I don't think that's very effective assessment.
And that's true on the faculty's end. On the student's end, to reiterate what I said, I hope it would be an important experience for the student.
That's right.
I guess another way of phrasing what Pat just said is the student must find that it's in his or her own best interest, and they must be willing to participate and not hesitant about what's going on about me, but that I'm involved in this process. I think that's ultimately very important.
I want to turn to our studio audience and ask, do you have a question about assessment methods?
Yes, I do.
Great. Why don't you tell us who you are and where you're from, and ask away.
Yes, my name is Patricia Dump, and I'm from Central Missouri State University at Warrensburg. And my question deals with collating all of this information and methods that you have with the external mandates. How, for instance, do you use portfolio review or external examiners or many of these other methods which you've explained to us when you need to report the results to the states?
Oh, yeah. Good question. Good question. Please. Gary.
I think one of the things that we need to get clear very early on is the external mandate often is not concerned with a number or a test score or whatever. They want to know what's the end result. And you take the program in the state of New Jersey, for example, their statewide assessment provides for a narrative description of what is your program like, what's the contents, who's involved. And that doesn't particularly provide a problem. They compile it, they distribute it and disseminate it across the state, and it gets fed back into the system. And so I think it's a myth that we have to do our external reporting with numbers and test scores.
Yes. Pat, and then we'll go back out for another question.
Yeah, I think I'm actually just going to probably say not quite as well as Peter could what he's said often, and that is there's a tendency on the part of campus people to read a mandate with standardized tests as the framework and assume that that's what's being called for. And Peter has said, be aggressive about looking for other alternatives and assert their value. And it seems to me like portfolio methods and some of the other things we've just listed have some obvious value and should be argued for.
Yes. Sir, please, from the audience.
My name is Chuck Wilson, and I'm from Donnelly College here in Kansas City.
Right.
The panelists seem to be promoting a very comprehensive kind of assessment, one that involves looking at learning from a variety of points and using a variety of methods, one that involves the whole institution. That seems to be a very ambitious kind of undertaking. Is that realistic?
Right. Pat Cross.
Well, the particular method of assessment that I'm most interested in, I've been criticized for not involving the whole institution, although I would maintain to some extent it does. I've been saying that, Ted, when you first introduced this, you said too often the cook doesn't taste the pudding.
Or only the cook tastes the pudding.
Tastes the pudding.
Right.
I want to chain that around a little bit and say too often not even the cook tastes the pudding.
Yeah.
There are too many times when professors in their own classrooms do not know what students are learning. So one of the simplest and one of the things that you can do without a lot of organization and without a lot of expense is to help teachers assess what the group of students before them in their classroom are learning. And I would broaden this to include educators as student personnel, people who are working with student organizations or any other group. But it seems to me to some extent it's an individual responsibility that does not need a lot of superstructure on it. It ought to pervade in all ways the institution.
Right. You know, I want to take the question. We should probably hear from Gary because he comes from a huge institution. But I want to introduce a longtime colleague of mine, Trudy Bonta from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. And the University of Tennessee at Knoxville has done more with assessment than any other research university in the United States, and it is large. And Trudy, do you want to take a shot at the question that was just answered? I mean,
Yes.
I mean, let's be realistic. A lot of people are going to say, this is all wonderful stuff, but look, we've got 40,000 students in our place. You've got to be crazy talking about doing this kind of stuff.
It is a formidable prospect to think of spreading assessment or a comprehensive program throughout an institution and doing it all in a year's time. Very often when we face what we think is an external mandate, and in many cases it is what we think and fear it is, but in many other cases it is a suggestion that we provide evidence that students are learning and that we are achieving our goals and objectives. But when we look at what could be done and think about the amount of time and resources that we have to put into it, we realize that we can't do it all at once. So one thing that is very helpful to understand and to think about is that you can start somewhere and you can build toward a more comprehensive program. We have found that a good place to begin is with some local surveys and start with some questions that are really important to faculty and to administrators, to teams that are looking at achievement in basic skills or achievement in general education. What are some concerns that the campus has? Begin with some small surveys that can be done quickly, and in a few months' time there can be some answers to some questions, and that will generate even more conversation.
Right.
And on we go from there. In the meantime, some pilot units that have an interest in getting started in testing in the major, for instance, may begin on their own to try some things. If they have some support, then they show the way for others to get involved. So soon you have people coming together to share what they have found, and ultimately that can all form a more comprehensive program that started small and realistically.
Trudy, thank you. Last June at the AAHE National Conference on Assessment in Higher Education, at which there were 1,000 people, I had a chance to talk with Alexander Aston of UCLA, author of 4 Critical Years, 10 other books, the annual ACE UCLA Freshman Survey, and one of the intellectual fathers of today's assessment movement. Let's see what Alexander Aston had to say on that occasion. A lot of the first wave of testing and instrument use that we've seen in higher education has concerned itself with student cognitive development.
Yeah.
And I know that you've had a lot of interest over the years in affective development and the relationship between in-class and out-of-class experiences.
Right.
How does that sort of carry over into the way you might think about assessment?
Well, I think we've made a mistake, a very serious mistake, in imagining, first of all, that there's this dichotomy between the cognitive and the affective. Just to take an example, I'm supposed to be engaged in cognitive learning with my students, but I must say after a number of years of doing this, I think our feelings about each other have more to do with what they learn and how they learn than any particular content that I try to convey to them. But that's, in other words, I think there is no division, and that's a conceptual error that we've made. But beyond that, I think that we have made the mistake of assuming, given that division, that the primary business of academia is cognitive learning and the development of the intellect as we conceive of it, whatever that means. And why I say that is that we have neglected the other side, if you will, the affect, the feelings, the self-concept, the ambitions, the hopes, the fears of our students. And the thing is that we have impacts on these affective aspects of students development whether we like it or not. In other words, we're influencing the whole student. We're not just influencing some piece that we decide to pick out. We're influencing it by the way that we model our own behavior for students, how we treat each other as faculty colleagues, how we relate to the administrators, how we relate to the counselors, how we treat students. We're modeling. In addition to this, by deciding to put students in residence halls, by bringing in certain kinds of programs on the campus, by whatever sorts of lectures or preachments that we give them in classes, by the selection of a core curriculum. I mean, that's going to influence students' values because we're saying we think this is important, and by implication what we don't teach is less important. So the point is that we're having influences all the time on our students' values and beliefs and self-concepts, and yet we've neglected even looking at these influences by I think erroneously assuming that we're only interested in the intellect. So if we do assess, we tend to give tests and exams and that focus pretty much on the kind of abstract reasoning or knowledge of subject matter.
Panelists, if we granted what Alexander Aston is saying about the union between the affective and the cognitive, how does it change the way you think about doing assessment? Gary?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to realize is that we can gain a lot of assessment information using the old adage that John Holland would teach us for years, is that if you want to know something about students, why don't you ask them? And we can use self-report information. And for years and years, self-report information was really kind of downgraded as an assessment technique. But if you take Alexander Aston's ideas about student involvement and how are students participating on our campuses and simply ask them to report, what are they doing? How many hours do they study? Do they study in the library? Do they study in their apartments or their residence halls? Do they participate in leadership development? Do they get involved in recreational sports and the development of their physical being? Those are all strategies and techniques that give you very valuable information, give you information that you can use rather immediately, and it's very, very useful.
Yes. Jackie?
To reemphasize that, though, the quality of those questions, especially in the self-reported information, is very important. Former colleague of both Gary and mine had 4 guidelines that she put together and said the students must first understand the question and must not be unambiguous. They must have access to the answer.
Right.
You know, and those kinds of things. And I just think that's important that in thinking about using self-reported data.
Pat Cross?
Well, I think one of the places that the intellectual and the affective come together most clearly is in so-called developmental education, where many people working with developmental students say it's not really a problem with the intellect, it's a problem with self-confidence, self-esteem, the willingness to take risks, to try to learn. And so one of the things that strikes me we might well use is so-called unobtrusive measures. If you go into a learning laboratory and you look at the beginning of the semester and almost everybody has their hand up wanting help all the time, toward the end of the semester you should see much more independence in learning if in fact that laboratory experience has boosted people's self-confidence. So simple things like unobtrusive measures may be useful in some of the assessment.
Pat?
Just a brief comment. I was talking about assessment in the major earlier and the interest there. It seems to me that that's also a place where the affective and the cognitive come together. If you talk to faculty in the English department, I think I could do that, I care that they know the facts of English literature, whatever that might mean, but I also care that they care about language. And that's an affective, very, very difficult thing to assess, but I care about assessing that. So that's another place for those to come together.
It's probably a little unfair to accuse you people of being test bashers, but I noticed I asked everybody sort of to bring forward a favorite assessment method or technique or concern, and nobody mentioned standardized tests. And yet if you go to a campus and talk about assessment, people want to know about those damn tests. We have a question from Dr. Weissman from Plymouth State College in Plymouth, New Hampshire, which is a little bit too long to read, but really is making the point that if we start, is an assessment going to mean tests, and aren't tests going to have to be taught for and studied for? Aren't standardized instruments going to drive what we do within colleges? Group?
I think the potential for that is definitely there. But I also hear the argument from faculty, and one of the things that we've done in the state of Texas in designing the basic skills assessment is to go out to the faculty and say, what should students be able to do to accomplish and perform well in mathematics, in reading and writing. And the faculty have defined the objectives, worked very closely with a standardized testing company to design. Now the question becomes if the faculty in the departments all over the state teach to those objectives, is that necessarily bad? I think the answer is no, when and if those objectives rise from the ground up from the faculty.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Okay, I've been asked to make an announcement. It seems that there is unusual sunspot activity going on in the solar system, which is interfering with the signal reception from satellites on some campuses. So hang in there. On Wednesday, I was driving here from Ottumwa, Iowa, and Dan Rather's whole show, radio show, got canceled because of unusual sunspot activity. So we're all going to try to hang in there. The other thing is that some people have had a little bit of difficulty reaching on the phone. I want to repeat again the phone number, which is area code 816-576-7141. That 576 prefix is a little bit different, mischievously, from what was in the coordinator's packet. So pay attention to the correct number. It will flash. There it is on the screen right now. We're going to take one more question, and then we'll have to end this segment. Sir, please tell us who you are and where you're from.
Hello, I'm Steve Peterson from Central Missouri State University. Yeah. Several times the reference by the panel has been to ask students for their feedback and to assess how they study, when they study, how long they study, and also to extract from them information from standardized or specified kinds of exams at the institutional level. What's in it for the students? How do we motivate them to want to be a part of this enterprise with us? It seems like we're asking them for a lot of information, a lot of times, and for a lot of feedback. And sooner or later, I wonder if they aren't going to tire of it. And how do we keep them excited? How do we keep them motivated? And how do we make them realize that there's something in it for them?
Can I turn to Pat Hutchings?
Well, let me answer that question by reference back to the one about standardized tests, and also, I guess, to my earlier answer about assessment center methods. It seems to me that the most important things in getting students invested in this is doing things that make sense educationally and that are inherently engaging for students. It seems to me that though there's a place for standardized tests in all of this, a multiple choice exam is one of the methods least likely to engage students, and so though you might want to do some of that, you'd certainly not want to do much. You might want to do much more of the richer, more qualitative, classroom embedded kinds of things that we've already set forward as examples.
Thanks, Pat. It's now time to end this segment of our program and go to section 4, which is headlined Assessment That Works. And panelists, I want to ask this question. Many institutions are already overrun with information. Do we need twice as much more? What are we going to do with twice as much more? Now, I know that all of you have spent a lot of time on campus lately and looking at this phenomenon, but under what conditions can or will assessment lead to improvement? Okay. Gary?
I think to really utilize information, there's a set of common characteristics of useful data that lead to getting faculty and students and faculty involved. And one of those has to do with specifying very early on in designing your assessment, your data collection efforts, is to identify the purposes. And everybody was going to have a different purpose. Anytime you get a committee together, going to be multiple purposes, but it's sifting and sorting, and that often takes a very long time. But you have to have very clear motives and purposes in mind. And then I think a second one is, through this discussion, you have to get rid of the myth and the fear of the unknown and try and walk through and disclaim all of those reasons why people say we shouldn't do this, because X, because Y, because Z. And that's another characteristic that leads to that definition of clear purpose, making sure you know what those are. And I think the other real clear characteristic is making sure that somebody's in charge, having clear responsibility on campus, and it may be multiple people, but knowing who's doing what and when. What happens with so much of this data is there's one office here that collects a little bit, and another office here that collects a little bit, and all of a sudden you have 27 places where the data is being collected and it's not being distributed. And having that common purpose and a common center, perhaps, where people can pull the data together and coordinate it back out is very, very critical. The dissemination is critical.
Assessment that works. Pat?
Yeah, an obvious, I suppose, follow-up to that, and that is it's important to recognize that no amount of data by itself will change or improve anything. And the thing I hear over and over from campuses that really seem to be going somewhere with this is that you need to spend more time and energy teasing out, is a phrase I've heard, making sense of, making meaning of that data and figuring out what to do with it than you do gathering it in the first place. So.
Yeah, somehow the idea gets around that there's some kind of a straight line connection between doing assessment and improvement following. My experience as an institutional researcher on campuses is that often the information that comes back is incomplete, it's sketchy, it doesn't really tell you why what happened occurred, nor does it tell you how to fix it. And there's quite a gap between the information that you would get from an assessment and what you need to do, and it is, and you almost need to see that the client of the assessment is good conversation rather than a specific change. Yes, Charles?
I think this gets back to Gary's point. You really need, I think, to look at some fundamental purposes, and I think something that student affairs folks can do with their academic colleagues is listen to what are the concerns, what are the campus issues, and how can we become more informed about those issues through assessment. So I think that is a key, to become more informed about things that are important to start with, and to identify those agendas and to move to inform ourselves about the nature of them and how we can respond to them.
Yeah. Trudy, I'm glad if you would jump in right here.
Together, the data from assessment is one of the most critical jobs that we have, because there was a lot of information out there to begin with, and what we're doing is creating more. So it's a matter of pulling it together and making it make sense. I think one of the most exciting things that has happened at the University of Tennessee with the data that we have collected is that it relates to the university's overall mission and planning goals. We collect data in each of a dozen different areas that the university thinks are important and for which there are written goals and objectives. Every year we are able to provide some indication of how far we've moved in that year and in several years in meeting those goals. When the information is put into a framework like that and made to have purpose, then it serves the interests of all on the campus. Not only now do we have university-wide goals, but that has extended to the colleges and to the departments. And the assessment in the classroom level is now feeding into the departmental ongoing objectives. The departmental objectives feed the college, and the college feed the university's steps toward improvement. We're all far more purposeful now about what we're doing than we were 5 or 6 years ago before we began our program.
Yeah. Peter, would you come up? You visited so many campuses and come in on this business of assessment that works.
I'll just add to what Trudy said. I think one of the single biggest things that hasn't been mentioned yet is administrative commitment to using the information, which has to be signaled very, very early. And I think some of the most successful campuses that I've seen have been campuses in which one of the top administrators, an academic vice president or the chief executive, has packaged a decision, if you will, around assessment information. It may have been one of the many things that went into the making of that decision, but putting the decision in the words of the assessment language has made a powerful statement that this is something that we pay attention to around here and will continue to pay attention to in the future. I think that's not to be ignored.
Top-level leadership is important, but how about climate, Peter? Why don't you just stay up there? How about climate? I mean, don't people have to want to really see something better happen in general education before the assessment of general education is really going to lead to any improvement in it?
Oh, sure. And I think that one of the things that is coming out of several of the comments that have been made already is the point that there has to be a natural constituency. I found time and time again visiting campuses with state mandates that one of the things that you have to do is to discover what the natural constituency is, that oftentimes there is faculty discontent with some aspect of the curriculum, and they have to be shown to the way that this issue can be used to attack that very concern. And I think that it behooves any of us who are trying to use this kind of movement creatively to find what that center of gravity or constituency is on each campus and to use it effectively.
Yes. Thank you. We're going to go to a couple call-in questions. The first is from Dr. Jack Bouts, Seattle Central Community College. He would like to know about the life cycle of a given assessment method. That is it ever finished, or is it in a state of constant evolution?
I think I commented on that a little bit earlier when I said assessment is a state of mind, and it's an attitude, and it's something that evolves. And I think the critical factor to recognize is that most successful assessment projects start small, they pilot test, the good things that work are kept, the mistakes that we make, don't always admit to, get cast aside, and it's evolutionary, and it's ongoing, and it's never over.
Yeah. Don't you think that anything that you would do, you would apply a cost-benefit test to, and at some point, the cost of doing something versus the benefits, any one approach may wear out its welcome. Okay. Pat, you have your hand up.
Well, it seems to me to really understand assessment, no, it is never finished because it's a constant feedback loop. That is, I don't see it as being a single chain where it's cut off at some point. But if you do good assessment, then it ought to have implications for your practice. You ought to check out whether you could improve by doing something. Then you would need to assess that again, and that would lead to further improvements. So one of the reasons you can say, no, this isn't a fad, is because it's probably never finished. If you do it well, it becomes a continuous loop.
Yes,
And typically the demand goes up for that kind of assessment because it works well.
Dr. Lucy Wilson of Old Dominion University in Virginia asks, I wholeheartedly agree that assessment should focus on the development of cognitive and affective skills. But how does one go about assessing such affective outcomes as interpersonal competence, empathy, maturity, and social responsibility? Gary?
That's tough because I think there's been a lag in both interest and the development of those kinds of instruments. I think one thing I would point to is that the American College Student Personnel Association has a clearinghouse for student development instruments at Bowling Green University. And they have a taxonomy of instruments that are available that people are either pilot testing currently or have tried out. There are very few commercial instruments, standardized instruments that are available. But ACPA has a clearinghouse. Likewise, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators in their research area circulate descriptions of studies that are going around. So one of the things when you get involved in trying to do the assessment of these more difficult to measure characteristics is to find out what other people around the country are doing. And there is a large network of people that are experimenting right now and tapping into that. There are people and there are places that are doing that.
Right. Pat Hutchings?
Yeah, it seems to me that that's the place to start. Look at resources, talk to people. The next step, you may find, however, that there's nothing out there suited to your purposes. What doesn't make sense to me at that point is to throw up your hands and say, well, we'll never be able to know anything about those things. Surely you can find some method that will take you further toward good information than where you are now. So try something. Make something up.
The fact that cognitive and affective domains are related to one another and that there is an assessment movement doesn't mean that everybody has to go out and start assessing empathy or something like that. And I would myself urge people to start with simpler things that are related to real perceived problems. One of them may be, what are students doing with their time? And if I may give an example, I saw one institution in Massachusetts that simply went around and asked students how much time they were spending studying, and what they found is that 90% of their full-time students had jobs. They had almost no time to go to the library. They were spending, and this is appalling, an average of 6 hours a week on their, out of class on their studies. Well, that set up a whole chain of conversation, needless to say, about expectations and responsibility for academic work within the faculty. But the point is, you can learn a lot just by asking. And it doesn't have to be real fancy, what you're doing. Jackie?
I will have to agree with you that asking the very simple and basic questions are ultimately important. I was surprised several years ago when I conducted a study of community and junior colleges looking at affective information, and less than a third of them were asking the very basic kinds of things that you were looking for, and I hope that's improved. In fact, I know it has. In talking with many college people today, that they have started looking at the very basic kinds of questions that impact student achievement and student needs and goals.
Yeah. I'm going to run out to the audience. Hi. Welcome. Thank you.
I'm Mel Cunningham from Johnson County Community College in Overland Park, Kansas. And I was wondering if anyone on the panel would like to discuss the relationship between assessment, if there is a relationship between assessment and teacher evaluation.
Oh. You mean the evaluation of professors at
how well
at
they're
the college
doing in the
level.
classroom.
Yeah, right. Who wants to wade into that? Pat Cross? You have tenure. Speak up.
Well, I think that is a difficult one. One of the, it's not as far apart as one might think. What I've been interested in is kind of self-assessment. And I think, like asking students to comment, we paid not enough attention to inquiring about professors of how well they're doing. Nevertheless, I think one of the ways of assessing, the most commonly used method for assessing teaching now, is the student report. And the student reports are frequently cast in the terms of how well are you learning, which is certainly a direct evaluation of how well the teacher is teaching, since that's the sole purpose of teaching, is to help students learn. So I think the student assessment measures, which have actually turned out to be far better as research instruments than most people give them credit for being. That is, they're better in terms of reliability and validity, and the students do tend to grade professors high who teach them a lot. So I think in that sense that the assessment of what students learn and the evaluation of teachers are intimately related. How to get those two any closer together than through the student, I'm not sure. But I think it's a good question, and it's a topic that deserves further study.
Pat?
Yeah, that all makes good sense in theory, but I feel compelled to throw in what I've been told by lots of campus people, and that is if you want to poison the assessment waters from the word go, that sounds like a horrible mixed metaphor, just attach it, even by rumor, with the evaluation of teachers for purposes of promotion and tenure. So it's difficult.
I would go along with that for purposes of promotion and tenure. But for self-assessment, for improvement, and those kinds of things, I think there is some connection.
I agree.
Good. We have a question from Jan Norton of Missouri Western State College. How do panel members respond to the questions or fears that assessment is just a way to compare institutions, possibly for deciding funding? Peter, you will. We're going to get you up here because I know you've done case studies in 5 or 7 states, and it has occasionally happened that information from some form of assessment, usually standardized testing, finds its way into newspapers through Freedom of Information Acts, and newspapers have a field day ranking and comparing institutions and making invidious comparisons, usually without any reference to the particular students different institutions are serving.
Yes, I think that you do have to put those fears somewhat in perspective, because there really are very few states at the moment that have the mechanism to do that, and that list has not grown. I think it's important to recognize that with the exception of a very carefully conceived effort in New Jersey that's statewide on a general intellectual skills examination, there is no state that has, since Tennessee and Florida, joined the ranks of institutions that are using standardized tests, with the exception of teacher evaluation, for any form of institutional comparison. So you do have to put it a bit into perspective. On the other hand, I think that it's important to look at the experience of those states where there has been some of this, in Florida and in Tennessee, and to recognize that, at least to some extent, the state authorities have been very careful to make sure that those comparisons occur very infrequently. In fact, it's the institutions often that will leak the information when they do well. So I think that it's incumbent upon state authorities to try to minimize that as much as possible, but particularly incumbent upon the institutions to make sure that the states don't fall back on methods like this where interinstitutional comparisons are there. I think it may be legitimate for comparisons to be made on what states or what institutions are doing in terms of assessment.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. We'll take one more audience question and then end this section. Hi, welcome.
Thank you. My name's Wayne Giles, Metropolitan Community Colleges here in Kansas City, and please excuse the cold. I'm very concerned about general education outcomes. And from the community college perspective, we have increasing enrollment of students who transfer to the upper division universities. What suggestions does the panel have for us in the community college sector to bring about some common discussion about general education outcomes for our students who eventually transfer to the four-year institutions?
Well, you know, in our opening and all throughout this conversation, we've talked about the shared responsibility interinstitutionally. But I think this question may prompt that there's a shared responsibility between institutions to discuss with one another what their general education goals and objectives are. And I think that's one way to address the question that you've just asked, Wayne.
We had an interesting experiment that had a delightful outcome in the state of Texas when we got involved in designing the Texas Academic Skill Assessment Program, where community college people met in the same room with four-year institutions and started talking about what do students really need to know to do well in school. And we looked at the dialogue in terms of those three basic skill areas, and that was coordinated across the state, and we got tremendous agreement. They conducted a survey to validate the objectives that the faculty came up with, and there was like 90% agreement across 2- and 4-year institutions. Phenomenal consensus that grew out of that. The real advantage, I think, of that whole process is it got the people talking, and they arrived at these kinds of general educational outcomes that were agreed upon, and it works.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to take one more call-in question. It's from two faculty members at Northern Illinois University, and the question, which I'll just paraphrase, is about faculty fear of assessment, which is very real, as we know.
Well, we've addressed some of that by talking about the connection between faculty evaluation for promotion and tenure and assessment, and that's a legitimate concern, it seems to me. The other fears I hear most often, well, let me back up a step. I often hear that faculty will be put off by, threatened by assessment, and usually it's administrators who tell me that.
Right.
The fact of the matter is, when I talk to faculty, it makes a good deal of very natural sense to them to find out more about their students, who are, after all, the students of their colleagues as well, to find out about their sort of collective movement towards some outcomes that people agree upon. And though there are certainly exceptions to this good news, there are lots of faculty in this country who found assessment brings to the forefront, you know, teaching and its importance in a way that hasn't happened before, and they find it as one person put it to me, a career-defining movement. So that's a concern, but it is not necessarily the norm.
When you go to administrator-dominated meetings, you hear faculty often described as the resistors, but when you talk with faculty, you find that they know a lot more intuitively about assessment than administrators do.
That's right.
Other people want to come in on this? Pat Cross?
I think it's a very important question, because those of us who work with assessment and work with campuses who are already into assessment are likely to discount that more because we've seen it kind of grow, the fears dissipate.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of campuses out there who still think of assessment as standardized tests and primarily comparisons and imposed from without and take a compliant sort of view to it, assessment is a whole different thing from what we've been talking about today, which is driven kind of internally because you want to know, not because you're complying with some external authority for some unrelated reason. So I think it's a valid reason, and the only way I know to go about it is to get people more familiar, perhaps through programs like this, or even better, programs on campus that discuss it. And then I think your view of, I think it's the more people who are more familiar with it, who are less afraid of it.
Yes. Pat, thank you. And with that, we're going to end the fourth program segment and go to a fifth, which is headlined, Getting Started. And at this point, it's very difficult, I think the panel would all agree, to generalize about how to get started, because that's always a function of what kind of institution we're talking about, the role of the person that you're advising, what they want to do about assessment. So let's be more specific and think about a long lunch between the academic and student affairs deans of a mid-sized university. You're their guest at lunch, and you're a consultant. You've been on a lot of campuses, and they want to know about getting started. Now, they know that over the course of 5 years, they want to see a lot of things evolve that are called assessment. They want them to do so organically. They know as deans that process and strategy matter a lot within an institution. So their question to you is, what tips do you have about getting started? How do you begin?
Well, I'll begin.
All right.
I would begin by asking very seriously whether you wanted to introduce the word assessment into the process you were about to begin on day one. And I would consider trying to bring questions to educators, faculty, and student development people both about what kinds of information they'd like about students. What do you want to know more about? What information will help you in working with students? And I'm not sure that I would begin by saying, now we're going to do assessment. I would begin with, what do we want to know collectively?
Yeah.
I think I would
Jackie?
have to strongly agree with Pat and say, and add to that, and that they clearly understand what their educational goals are. I think this conversation that the academic deans and the student support deans are having is important, that we have some commonality about what our educational process and goals and activities are going to be. And if those are clearly set out, then they can follow up with the other things that we've been talking about.
Charles?
I think part of that is also to reflect on what do we already know that we may not be informing folks that have real legitimate questions. So I think part of it is starting with what you already know and then trying to find out what additional things do we need to know to help us.
And the other piece of that is, I think, start with people who are most interested. Find a department that's turned on or individuals who are turned on and start there and provide them the resources to help them understand and design the program. And I think you'll have much more success than if you attempt to drag reluctant people into it.
Yeah, and it's sort of, once people see what it can do and what the ideas are behind assessment, there's sort of a germ that spreads and the thing more easily can take root. Yeah. Any other, Peter or Trudy, do you want to, you've been on so many campuses that have been at the point of getting started. Is there any way that you want to jump into this? Here we have Peter taking the microphone.
I'll just confirm, I think, the existing information point that's been made. I think not only existing information, taking a very careful inventory of what you already know, and you may in fact find many duplicative sources of information, which in itself is an interesting thing and a useful thing to find out, because you can begin to coordinate them much more effectively and make them so that they add up to something. But the existing information gives you a place to start in interpretation. You can start to tell the story already and start posing some questions to an existing database and say, all right, now what don't we know? And the question about what don't we know is really the next step in trying to design a research agenda. I think the same thing can be done with goals, that we ought to take a look at what are our existing goal statements, sorry though they may be in most cases, and to say how could we improve them in the light of existing information.
Yes, thank you, Peter. We have a call-in question from Barbara Fleischer of Loyola University of the South, which is in New Orleans. And she asks, could you say something about the process of gaining consensus on learning objectives to be assessed? That's a hard question. Let me even expand that slightly to the panel and say the gospel of assessment is you start with objectives. But I know institutions that have spent 5 years trying to clarify their objectives, for example, for general education. Does that mean we can't do any assessment until some 5-year process has gone by? How about this question of objectives and goals?
Well, the quick answer is you can overdo it. You can talk general education outcomes for 10 years and never get to the point of gathering any assessment information or doing anything about the curriculum. Those conversations probably have some good marginal and unintended effects, maybe some intended ones too. But after a certain point, I think they begin to spin wheels.
Yeah, Jackie?
I think I would refer this caller back to something Pat Cross just said, is that you start with the people who were most energized and most active and want to be a part of the discussion first. And that's how you draw consensus. And you get a smaller group working who say, this is what we want to do. We agree on this. And they take that one step. And then you draw other people in as you go along. I think that's one of the best
Maybe you can't
ways
figure out every objective in the whole world, much less for your whole college. But if there's a group of people who can figure out what the objectives should be for a sequence of math courses, do it.
To go there first.
Pat Cross.
In my work in trying to get more assessment into the classroom, I found it's absolutely necessary to allow for different objectives. That is, the purpose may not always be to be consensus, but for instance, math teachers may really have different, legitimately different expectations and goals from what history teachers have. And so I think part of the thing is to allow for different kind of objectives, not always strive for consensus, but let certain groups who have common objectives go at it that way, and somebody who has some other objectives go at it in some other way.
Yeah. Charles?
Just a quick comment. I'm reminded of a quote in the book In Search of Excellence that said, ready, fire, aim.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we just need to get in there and do it, and in the process of doing it, some of the real questions emerge, and some of the things give us the focus we need.
Yeah, that's good. Trudy?
To echo that, I think that many times it's impossible to achieve consensus, and you certainly should not begin by telling faculty what to do. So if we suggest to them that they must start with objectives, there may be a negative reaction. They may decide to play with it a little bit and gather some information and start from there. I have found in our experience that many times they will go, a faculty will go through the whole procedure of developing an instrument. They simply contribute items or contribute experiences to go into an assessment instrument. They will gather data, and then when they say, what do we have? Then is when the light dawns that it needs to be tied to some larger sense of purpose. Then is when they are ready to begin to formulate their objectives.
That ties in nicely with Charles Schroeder's comment. Peter?
Just a footnote, one of the exercises that I found very useful is an expectations exercise with an existing instrument to simply ask the faculty to sit down and say, what ought it to look like? Let's put a profile together of, if it's a survey, a set of items, a test, the subscores, or whatever, if we were achieving what we thought we could achieve, and then lay the actual data up against it. Yeah. In retrospect, there's this wonderful tendency to say, I knew it all along. It's good to get those expectations on the table to begin with, because they're approximations through the instrument of what those shadow goals really are.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. One of the, just to conclude this section on getting started, a circumstance that Pat Hutchings mentioned a few minutes ago was that nobody has to start from scratch. There is now a literature and places to turn for help, meetings to go to and the like, and we've put together 4 little places that you can go for help that we want to describe to you. The first is, and I think there will be cards that will come up on the screen, is the AHE Assessment Forum. And Pat, what is the AHE Assessment Forum doing, or what should people do as this address goes up on the screen?
Well, a couple things just newsworthy about next ventures from the Assessment Forum. Almost a year from now, June 21st through the 24th of next year, will be our 4th National Conference on Assessment in Higher Education. More immediately, we're coming out with a second round of commissioned papers, some 6 new papers. and those are announced and available in your resource packets, all of you on downlink sites. In general, let me say that many of you are inevitably on one of our many mailing lists. If you're not, and you're looking to receive materials about assessment, just write, and we will make sure that you do henceforth.
The AHE Assessment Forum enjoys support from the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, which is, I want to especially credit for supporting so much of the underlying campus activity that we draw upon in a teleconference like this. The Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, or FIPSE, has also supported an Assessment Resource Center, which is directed by Trudy Bada, who happens to be here, and they will put the name and phone number of the Assessment Resource Center on the thing. It's a place to call or go for information, especially about tests and methods. Trudy, don't you have a meeting or a workshop next month that people might know about?
Yes, on November 14th and 15th in Knoxville. We are gathering our colleagues from Malverno College, Northeast Missouri State, Miami-Dade Community College, and the University of Tennessee Knoxville together to form a panel, and we will have concurrent sessions talking about strategies for assessing outcomes. Our Assessment Resource Center also has a variety of materials that can be ordered by colleges and universities interested in assessment and interested in methods and techniques. We also convene some periodic seminars to discuss additional methods. Good. And would welcome inquiries at the address indicated.
At this point, because time is tight, should they just call you up, Trudy, or call up the Assessment Resource Center?
About the conference in November, yes. I believe there was a number on the screen.
Right. We are not going to give people your home phone number.
We would be pleased to have calls at our office.
Okay. The third thing that we want to mention, thank you, Trudy, is the ERIC system. And the ERIC system, my goodness, stands for Educational Resources? Information Center? Right. Okay, the ERIC system is one of these large electronic databases that is accessible through almost any library. And so go to the librarian and tell him or her that you want to access ERIC and find out what ERIC has to do about assessment. And the way to do that is to go into the higher education part of the database and use as the indicator or search word AAHE Assessment Forum. If you put that in as a search word, bingo, it'll pop up 30, 40, 50 annotated documents that will take you a long way to giving you a bunch of things to read, ruin a whole week's worth of vacation. The last thing that we want to mention is a book that came out last month called Judgment and Performance, edited by Clifford Adelman. And what this publication is about a dozen essays, juried essays, very carefully prepared. One of them is by Trudy Bada, as I recall. And it's a bargain at, what is it, $15? It's a bargain. And what you'll also find in there is a terrific essay, usually on particular topics within assessment, like assessing the major, followed by a magnificent bibliography with all the 88 references in it. So I would strongly recommend ordering Judgment and Performance if you want to read your way into this topic more deeply. Okay, that concludes the fifth and final segment of the formal part of our program. Before I turn to our panelists for one last word, I want to remind everybody that the phone number is area code 816-576-7141. We are going to go entirely to phone calls in 10 minutes when we go to the call-in section shortly. But before we do that, I want to conclude the formal section of our program by giving each member of our panel one last chance to say something significant. Charles?
Something significant. Well, I think one of the fascinating things about the teleconference and the focus of the teleconference is the notion of a shared responsibility. I think as we reflect on the vast number of reform reports that have challenged us to focus on issues of importance to our students, to our institutions, I think it calls on student affairs folks to work in new and creative ways with faculty. We do know a lot about students. We know a lot about the way they learn and about the way they develop. Unfortunately, we have chosen to use that knowledge primarily within the organizational boundaries of the Student Affairs Division. I think what the assessment movement provides as a challenge and an opportunity is to move beyond those boundaries and to start working in more intentional ways, communicating what we know so that faculty will have the benefit of that and we can work in a collegial way on some of these important issues.
Yes. Thank you, Charles. Pat Cross?
I certainly want to heartily re-endorse that shared responsibility. But I want to add to that I've used the words intellectual investment of all educators. I think all of the educators ought to be intellectually invested in what they're doing and how well they're doing it. And by educators, I mean faculty, I mean student personnel people and administrators, so that they really surface questions that they want to know the answer to in order to improve their performance.
I think one thing I would add is the recognition that assessment is a long-term investment of time and energy, and that it's not going to happen overnight. There are successful colleges with programs that are 10 and 12 years old now, but they started out small. They started out pilot testing, doing things locally within a department, and grew from there. And I think keeping that in mind, that it's not only long-term, but it can be very expensive. And there has to be institutional commitment. And when you have staff turnover and changing institutional structures, there has to be some way to maintain an ongoing commitment.
Thank you, Gary. Jackie?
I think I would like to add my challenge to the professional educators to collaborate with one another and with students for successful assessment. And I think a second point that I'd like to bring up would be we've now come in this movement to a point of not asking what but why, but also looking at the different student populations. We have a rich theoretical base in assessment now. We have some good case studies on traditional students, and I think we need to move beyond that and come up with some good case studies and some good information, some good practical information on our non-traditional students, which make up a large portion of both our 2- and 4-year institutions.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Pat Hutchings?
I guess I'm on the collaboration and shared responsibility theme as well. There's a certain irony in the fact that one of the hardest parts of assessment is to get people talking about it in the first place. There is a resistance, I think. Once they start, I think there's an opposite and maybe more dangerous inclination, and that is to keep talking only to each other, so that you have assessment committees going at it like crazy. I think one of the things we need is to continually enlarge and refresh those assessment conversations by attaching them, both within institutions and in larger ways, to conversations about general education, conversations about improving teaching, and so on and so forth. We need to keep making the circle bigger. We need to keep assessment from being just a little office down the hall, or, as Peter Ewell has often said, a train on its own track. So we need to keep the connections.
Thank you. Thank you. That concludes the formal part of our program. Now, I know at this point a few downlink sites intend to sign off and proceed on with their own follow-on kind of conference. Before you do so, I want to say to them, to the people in those sites and to people in all sites, there is one other chore that we would like you to do. It's housekeeping in nature, but please do complete the evaluation forms that are part of your packet. We need that feedback from you and as panelists, but we also need it within the 3 associations, AAHE, ACPA, and NASPA, to direct efforts in future programs to needs that you tell us you have. So everybody, please complete the evaluation form before you leave. Okay, this is the end of the formal 2-hour segment of this program. Those of you who intended to sign off after 2 hours, now is the time to turn off the tube and go to work. Everybody else, stand by. We're going to go to questions. Well, now that we got rid of all the people who had to leave early because it's Friday afternoon, let's see if we have questions coming in on any of the lines. And Don, are you sending in questions on the line? Not yet. Okay. We have plenty of questions that have already been called in, and I am going to go to some of those. This is a question from Kathy Moran at Buffalo State College in New York. And in what ways have institutions that have developed assessment programs taken into account the diversity of backgrounds of our students? In other words, when faculty set up standards of performance, is it being done with the students' prior learning or lack of learning taken into account. Gary, that has to have been a big problem in Texas in setting up an entry-level test that is really going to say some people can go into credit level work and some people may not be able to.
It's a tremendous problem, and I think the issue that needs to be resolved when you start talking about this issue of diversity and the incredible differences that students bring to our institutions of higher education is to find out, going back to what we've said before, is what do you want to know about them, and look at what's already been done and try and achieve some kind of consensus about those particular objectives that you can measure and assess at one point in time, and then not stop there, but then individualize it as much as you can. There's some very good work being done in computerized adaptive testing, for example, that allows computer-assisted administration of assessment, for example, that really does facilitate that individualized assessment.
Yeah. Anyone else want to take a shot at that question?
I just want to challenge the colleges to stretch their thinking about collecting complete student background information. We tend to want to collect just a standard set of information on students and not want to reach beyond to look at the experiences the students have had outside of their academic environments, even prior to coming to our higher educational institutions. And a lot of the experiences and achievements that students have made there that are not typical or traditional will impact the kinds of experiences and their willingness to participate in our higher educational experiences. And we must start asking those questions on a regular basis.
Yes, Gary, one more thing?
Yeah, Jackie's comment made me think of one other thing that I think the institutions are obligated to expand and come up with alternative assessment, and that's one of the big issues in the Texas Academic Skills Program, is to have, for those students who have high levels of test anxiety, who are dyslexic, learning disabilities, to provide other ways of capturing that information through portfolio, performance on schoolwork that they can bring in, have external examiners.
Okay, we're going to have a little fun, gang. We're going to cut out the middleman and the cards and the people running in from the phone booth, and we're going to talk to some people live. Hello, you're live on the air. This is the assessment conference. Where are you calling from?
Hello?
Oh.
I'm calling from Traverse City, Michigan at Northwestern Michigan College.
Yes, this is Ted Marquesi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good. Go on. Ask your question, please.
Okay. Will mandated outcome assessment for community college graduates become a reality within the next 5 to 10 years for most states?
Thanks for your question. Gang?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess the immediate answer is probably. I mean, as I think, I don't know the exact number now of the number of states that are requiring it, but
well, I'm not sure. I think the reference is to Rising Junior exam.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, it might have been. We should have kept the caller from Traverse City on the line. There is such a thing as a Rising Junior exam, which means that students at the end of the sophomore year have to pass some kind of a test before they can rise into their junior year.
I guess I took the question to mean just generally have the states in which community colleges exist, are they going to be requiring testing? But if he's talking about Rising Junior, that's another.
Well, my understanding is more states have probably conscientiously rejected the Rising Junior test than have been putting it in. I think it started initially.
Right.
And so for that reason, I would lean toward thinking probably, I don't know why we would be any more likely to say that an associate's degree needs certification than that a bachelor's or a master's or any other degree. So I think I would lean toward saying I don't see it as a trend. I don't see it as inevitable.
If he's talking about the Rising Junior, but he's talking about just testing in general, that's another story.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the Rising Junior exam, that's an idea that, except in Texas, hasn't flown anywhere else from its initial origins.
In Florida it exists.
Well, Florida from years ago in the class exam, right. But community colleges are the same as everybody else and being affected by the new rules and accreditation and by state mandates and whatever else without any differentiation from four-year colleges.
But I think the trend is away from the Rising Junior certification to the emphasis on helping students. And you do that by assessing some of these basic skills, some of the other kinds of dimensions when students are coming in. So we give them a chance to participate participate in remediation and learn something about how to succeed in college.
Yes.
That's the direction it's going.
Peter, please.
Just a caveat on that, although it doesn't refer to community college graduates, concomitant with what Gary is saying, though, is, I think, a trend toward exit basic skills testing from remediation.
Yes.
Which is, of course, a major community college function.
Okay. We're going to take a call live on line 2. Hello? Hello, you're on the air. Can you hear me? Hello, you're on the air. Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Good. Tell us who you are and where you're calling from.
This is Lou Jean Moyer at Northern Illinois University.
Yes. How are you?
Fine.
Please ask your question.
Yes. Assessment of the university major is really the realm of the employer. What efforts are currently underway to encourage the establishment of linkages for assessment beyond the campus into the professional workplace?
Yeah, oh, that's a very good question. I'll tell you, I'm going to hang up so that you can go back and watch the answer on TV, and we'll have the panel go with that question. Please.
Well, lots of assessment programs include a piece that looks at employers' evaluations of former students, and that seems to me to make lots of sense. Equally interesting, it seems to me, are departments who bring in people from the professional community to serve as external examiners or consultants to the department. I mean, there are a number of interesting capacities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the community, I'm sorry, I think the community colleges have done an excellent job of having employer advisory panels that come in and give them advice on what kinds of needs, what kinds of skills that they have to have out there.
Yeah. I was just going to say the same thing Gary said, that that's not new in the community college sector at all. They've always had employers as advisors on advisory committees.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's take a call on line 3. Hello, can you hear me? You're on the air with the assessment teleconference.
Yes, thank you. This is Dr. Simcoe at Kennesaw State College, and we have been looking at assessment here and find some very interesting aspects with it, but I think one of the basic questions that has arisen would be, don't some assessment methods significantly strain faculty time needed for other things like advisement and dissertation research and things of that nature?
Yes. Thank you. Again, I'll hang up so that you can go back and hear the answer. The question again is about the drain, as it was put, of assessment activities on faculty time. Okay.
Well, I guess one question is, how better could faculty be spending their time than trying to find out how effective they are? That is, there are a lot of things we could probably do away with to preserve faculty time, but the second part of the question would be, again, back to the kind of naturalistic use of assessment as an ongoing kind of thing. In my own concept of classroom research, for instance, it's very hard to distinguish between a teaching technique and an assessment technique, so that while you're teaching, you would be getting assessment. Now, that's not quite true when you have a large institutional assessment program, and where you're asking people to serve on assessment committees. But Pat has made the point here this afternoon that those are conversations that ought to be taking place, and maybe assessment is a wonderful vehicle to use for conversations that should be taking place anyway.
Yes. Other people want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, just a brief comment. It seems to me that the problem of assessment taking away from other things that faculty need to be doing, though it depends on what list of those you're talking about, is more problematic when you call it assessment. When you call it a natural and ongoing part of teaching and working with students, a lot of that problem disappears. And for I certainly know faculty, and I was one of them, for whom the line between assessment and teaching and so forth was non-existent, as Pat has said.
Okay. Hello, you're on the air.
Hello.
Hi. Tell us who you are and where you're calling from.
I'm Mary Valentich from the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta.
Oh, good. A call from Canada. Thank you. Please, you're on the air.
Thank you. I'm interested in, it's like also hearing myself on TV. I'm interested in the relationship between assessment, in particular qualitative assessment for grading purposes, and student appeals of grades. I'm curious about the kinds of policies that the institutions have developed where they have engaged in very comprehensive assessment.
Okay. Thank you for the call. I'll hang up. And this is a question about the use of assessment methods within individual courses, and perhaps in the assignment of grades, and whether there should be an appeal. Does anybody here have any experience with that question? And it's perfectly okay to say, we don't know.
I don't think I have an answer to the question at all, but it brings up the issue of whether assessment is a different thing from grading or other more traditional names for evaluating students. And in many institutions, those are kept separate. There are some where there are not. And I think one of the things we've been saying today is that there is increasingly a movement to embed assessment in normal classroom activities, normal faculty activity. Maybe that gap will decrease.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pat. We'll take another call. Line 2, hello, you're on the air. This is the Assessment Teleconference.
Hello,
Hello. Tell us who you are and where you're from.
my name is Carla Satchwell,
Mm-hmm.
calling from the University of Wyoming.
Good. Please, may we have your question?
How can we assure that assessment is being used to truly develop the needs of the student and not being used to justify present policy and practices?
Okay, thank you. I'll put it to the panel, and you may go back to the set. Thank you. Group?
I think one of the ways to tell is to ask the student, to go back to them and get feedback really in the opposite direction that we've been talking about all day, is to ask them, well, what do you think? What's going on? How well is it working? And we have to find out some of these kinds of things from them to do that.
Isn't there lurking behind this question a question of power and whose interests are being served? Supposing the information that comes back from students, Gary, is that, no, this isn't very helpful at all to us. Might be very helpful to the institution, though.
Well, I was just going to comment. I think the issue of the power, one of the problems is that students may not see the immediate effect. And when changes are made, whether it's in the classroom and curriculum, whether it's a leadership development course or whatever, it may not happen overnight. Mm-hmm. And it's going to take a while. And that's why I think people and institutions need to provide a variety of different ways to disseminate information back to faculty, back to staff, back to students, back to alumni, so that once they leave the institution, they may not get the feedback immediately, but they have a sense of, I made a difference. I gave information, I participated in a survey, I was involved in an assessment process, that it didn't help me, but it helped someone else. And we use that in our survey work at Texas. When we ask for participation, we say, you have an opportunity to help students in the future. And we get tremendous participation rates because we're appealing to that sense of empowerment of the students' participation in the assessment process.
Very interesting. Charles?
I'll respond to that in a slightly different way. We've got an interesting project going on our campus where we have a researcher physically living in the residence halls, trying to understand, much as Margaret Mead tried to understand the experience of Samoa, what it's like to be a freshman, and to try and understand the emergence of a freshman culture. Now, each week that researcher meets with a group to share her observations and to see if there are any patterns to those observations, whereupon we then go back to students and ask and try and validate. So I think it's one thing to use more formal kind of quantitative methods. It's another to use qualitative methods to try and understand the way students make meaning of their own experience and the terms they use. They do not talk about their experience in cognitive terms or psychosocial terms. They talk about it in a different way. And trying to understand that, I think, is important.
You bet. Jackie?
I think one of institutions ought to look at one of the indicators of success is not only the kind of feedback they get, but where that feedback comes into the process, that not only are they getting it from the students who were there on campus, but are they getting it from employers, and are they getting it from new students that are coming in? Can they see some trends and some differences in what's going on all the way through, not only existing students, but students coming in or students expressing some interest in perhaps coming in, and from other people in the community. So there are a lot of different feedback arenas that institutions ought to look at.
Yes. Let's take another call. Hello, you're on the air. That person has left. Let's go to line 1. Hello, you're on the air. This is the Assessment Teleconference.
This is Jim Glenn, Dakota State College, Madison, South Dakota.
How are you, sir? Please ask your question.
For Gary Hansen, what's being done in assessing students' self-evaluations regarding their own learning and development, and in getting their judgments regarding how they credit various campus influences for this development?
Okay, this is about student self-assessment. Thank you for your call. I'll disconnect you so that you can go back to the set.
There's been a real increase in student self-assessment. The whole concept of the student development transcript, for example, where students are allowed to monitor and take a look on a regular basis. What have I been involved in going through college? And that might be a whole wide variety of not only classroom activities, but out-of-classroom accomplishments in terms of participation in recreational sports, participation in campus cultural things, and monitoring and keeping track. There have been some things at Nebraska. I believe the University of Maryland has a sales project. So there are a number of things, and Charles talked earlier in the program about developing databases to help students monitor so that when they leave, they would have a record of their involvement in a collegiate experience.
Yeah. Okay. Line 2. Hello, you're on the air.
All right. My name is Dr. Lucy Wilson. I'm calling from Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia.
Good.
I wonder if the panel could provide some clarity on the role of faculty advisement as it relates to assessment and student outcomes.
Okay. Thank you. What's the relationship between faculty advisement and outcomes assessment? While you all try to think of an example, I will name the one of Rhode Island College. Is that what you were going to name, Trudy? Well, at Rhode Island College, they have attempted to take a lot of different kinds of information, some of it from testing, some of it from students' prior records, and put it together in such a way that it is, well, it's actually done on computers, so that they write students a lengthy advisement letter that tells them sort of where they are, what the options might be, makes a number of suggestions, and it's very personally done. And this is a way, in effect, to take information gleaned from assessment and other sources and communicate it in a way that it means something to a student, used directly in the advisement process. Of course, they do stuff like this at Miami-Dade Community College, too. Trudy?
I just want to emphasize how close a relationship there is between assessment and advisement. In the first place, at a large university, the contact with the advisor may be the best way that students can find out about the philosophy of assessment and learn how important it is to the faculty and to the university that students participate in advising in an honest and conscientious way. The communication there about the way the information is being used can be critical to getting students involved. The other way that the two are linked is that in finding out about weaknesses that may show up on some sort of exam, or in finding out about student unhappiness about certain processes that are linked with the academic major or program, we find that advising may be the very key, the key to the whole unlocking the way to find a way to correct it. If students are choosing the wrong way through the curriculum, they are not going to be able to accomplish the goals that faculty have in mind, and it's advising that will allow them to make their way through the curriculum. So advising may very well direct us toward the improvements that we seek.
Trudy, right behind you, Larry Rose has an advisement assessment connection thing.
The third piece of that connection, very quickly, as a footnote, seems to me to be, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if faculty advisors spent some time with students emphasizing educational goals and constructing an educational program rather than simply filling out course lists?
Okay, there is an old battle. Line 1, Assessment Teleconference. You're on the air.
This is Janice Van Dyke. I'm at the State Technical Institute in Memphis, Tennessee.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Please, the panel is yours with a question.
I have a question for Peter Ewell. And based on his research, what would you say to a group of legislators who are considering mandating assessment and connecting it to money?
You bet. Thank you for your question. I'll hang up so that you can go back to the set. Peter?
I hope there are
What
no
is your advice to legislators who are thinking about concocting a mandate?
The first thing that I would ask, and in fact do ask, is why are you doing this? What specific kinds of things do you want to know about the performance of higher education? Is it a question of some specific thing that you are not getting information about? Is it a general feeling that educators are simply not forthcoming? Is it that you don't know what's being done to improve higher education? What's the specific kind of thing which is leading to the question that you're asking? I would then try to talk a bit about some of the various alternatives that states have examined in order to engage in this kind of process, and there are many. But I would first say, can you engage in a dialogue with the campuses to find out how they might be able to answer the questions you have already?
Thank you, Peter. Assessment Teleconference, you're on the air.
I'm placing this call for Dr. Robert Swift at Plymouth State College in Plymouth, New Hampshire. Much discussion of assessment has centered on academics. What about assessment of student affairs, quality of life, campus and community service, and social responsibility?
Good. Thank you for your question. I'll hang up so you can hear the answer. Panel?
Well, I'll give a stab at that. Those are very, very good questions. I think some of the structures that some places are using are the developmental transcript concept that does help students monitor the kind of experience they have in relation to specific skills and goals they have. I think others are looking at perhaps changes in values that are a function of involvement in social service activities, volunteer programs, whatever. So I think there are campuses that are focusing on that. But one of my concerns about the assessment movement is that it can become too narrowly focused on content mastery and other things. And these are very important issues when we think about holistic development and about what we certainly sell to the people that we want to attend our institutions.
Yes, George Koo of Indiana University has a grant from the Lilly Endowment to study, as you know, campus environments identified by their peers as having unusually rich out-of-class experiences. And one of the things that the teams are going to do when they visit these 10 or 15 case study places is ask the assessment question. How would you assess? Peter Ewell.
Just a comment, because it hasn't been mentioned so far, and I think that it ties to this question. Alumni research. One of the things that it hasn't been mentioned as a major component of an assessment program is taking a look at alumni and asking questions of alumni about things like community involvement and values kinds of items can be very revealing as well.
Yes, thank you, Peter. We'll go to another question. Hello, you're on the air, the Assessment Teleconference.
Hello, I'm calling from Christopher Newport College.
In Virginia. Tell
Virginia.
us. The panel is yours, sir.
I'm Dr. Dennis Ridley.
Dennis, how are you? This is Ted. Pat Hutchings is here too. Please ask your question.
The question is, what role can or should students have in shaping assessment plans and programs?
Thank you. I'll disconnect you so you can go back to your set. Panel, what role should students play in shaping assessment policies and plans? Trudy Bonnet. It's going to save you all.
Students can certainly participate in pilot testing of instruments when there are assessment procedures put together by a given faculty. They need to try them out, and students on other campuses may become the pilot population for instruments on our own on a given campus, and we can, as a matter of fact, collaborate in doing this for each other. Another way that students can be involved is in helping us find ways to use the results. I am very pleased to have the participation of the student government president on our advisory group for program evaluation, and along with the faculty members of that group, the student leaders are telling us about their reactions to the generalizations that we're deriving from the data that we collect. So it's very helpful to have that perspective in using it.
Trudy, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Panels have thought of something. Pat?
Just a brief comment. Trudy's talking about her experience. There are a number of campuses that have involved students in planning assessment programs. I think that's all to the good. One of the interesting features of that is that in many of those cases, students are proud of their institutions for doing that. They see that as an indication that that institution really cares about doing a good job, and that good job, after all, is for them in some way. So it goes over well with students if presented
That's been a very common experience of the early institutions into this. Jackie?
I think also in the advisement process, students it can be shared with students what kinds of questions the institution has asked, what kinds of questions the program has asked, and to glean from them what kinds of questions they have and what their goals are for their educational programs. And that too can be helpful and be a part of the planning of the process.
Gary?
Very quickly, we had a group of students that were involved in the design of an assessment instrument, and they are very good contributors to the point that Jackie made earlier about expanding our ideas about what to assess and how to assess it. We had a group of faculty, students, and student affairs administrators all in the same room talking about what should be assessed and how should we assess it, and the students were marvelous. Get them involved. It's a great way to do it.
Okay. That's a good point to end, I think, and this does bring us to the end of our program. I want to thank you for your calls and for your realizing that only a fraction of those calls got answered. All your questions, though, have been written down and will be studied by the panelists and the sponsoring associations as a guide for future work. I want to thank each of our panelists today. Pat Hutchings from AAHE, Jackie Woods from the Association of Governing Boards, Gary Hansen from the University of Texas, Pat Cross from the University of California at Berkeley, Charles Schroeder from St. Louis University. I also want to thank Trudy Bonta from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, Peter Ewell from NCHEMS, and Larry Rose from Kirchie, if I may be allowed one more acronym, for their many contributions to this show. Thank you very much. Now, the six of us on this stage have worked collaboratively on this project. We've tried to make it as helpful as we could to you in your work. I know that I speak for all of my colleagues on this stage in thanking you for your good attention, for your questions, and for the good things you already do on behalf of students. Now, we're acutely aware of the limitations of the television medium. The time goes by so swiftly. Television seems to demand quick, short answers, and many complex questions today were treated at only a first level of response. In many cases, there are second and third levels of response available, and some of the resources that we've mentioned will lead you to them. But in more than a few cases, the honest answer is there isn't more known about the phenomenon. We're also entirely aware of the dangers of generalized statements about what to do. You can generalize about assessment as a phenomenon, but when it comes to your own situation, there just aren't canned answers. You already know that many different things are possible in the name of assessment, that it's no one thing, so much as a mindset applied on a particular campus to a particular problems. So the authentic assessment you do create, you will create yourself. And we commend that to you as a task. Do it collaboratively, in good spirit, with good, real debate. Set about that task that you may meet even better the nation's call, and that of every man and woman who comes to us as a student for education. Good luck then. Let your own discussions now begin.